Hello everyone, in this class we'll try to learn about hypothalamus. The learning objectives of this class would be to name major nuclear groups of hypothalamus, list the functions of hypothalamus, understand the role of hypothalamus in endocrine, autonomic and reproductive functions and in regulation of temperature, circadian rhythm, sleep and food and water intake. Describe the regulation of food intake and understand the abnormalities of hypothalamic functions. Hypothalamus is a small structure, but it subserves many important functions of the body. The hypothalamus is an essential component of regulation of many homeostatic functions, physical functions, behavior, sleep, wakefulness, body rhythms, that is circadian and seasonal, and reproductive functions. For its widespread connections and functions, the hypothalamus is considered as a major integrating center in the brain. Though its connection with pituitary gland, it controls major endocrine and reproductive functions. Through its connections with brainstem, it controls cardiovascular, respiratory, autonomic, and thermoregulatory functions. As well, through its connection with limbic system, it controls behavioral function, and through its connections with cortical areas, it controls higher functions including learning and memory. See the anatomy. The hypothalamus is a small structure in the brain, lies on each side of the third ventricle. It weighs around 10 grams. It is located below the thalamus and hence it is called as hypothalamus. Along with the hypothalamus and subthalamus, it forms the diencephalon. The hypothalamus consists of a large number of nuclei and nuclear groups. It comprises of four main nuclear groups, which can be described as the anterior group, middle group, posterior group, and lateral group. Anterior group includes preoptic, supraoptic, and paraventricular nuclei. Middle group consists of tuberal, arcuate, ventromedial, and dorsomedial nuclei. Posterior contains supramammillary, mammillary, and posterior hypothalamic nuclei. Lateral comprises the lateral preoptic and lateral hypothalamic nuclei. So this is the diagram showing the different group of neurons, where it is showing the preoptic nucleus, supraoptic nucleus, anterior nucleus from the anterior part, the ventromedial nucleus, the arcuate nucleus, dorsomedial nucleus from the middle part, and the mammillary and posterior nucleus of the posterior part. And if you see from the sagittal section, you can see the lateral hypothalamic area and also lateral tuberal nucleus, which forms the lateral group of nuclei. Hypothalamus, through its afferents and efferents, is connected with almost all parts of the brain. Following are some major connections of hypothalamus. Fornix. Through fornix, hypothalamus is reciprocally connected with limbic system. And through the medial forebrain bundle, it is extensively and reciprocally connected with the brainstem, including reticular formation and limbic system, especially the septum via median forebrain bundle. The median forebrain bundle also connects brainstem with cerebral cortex. Periventricular system reciprocally connects midbrain through sensory pathway to hypothalamus. Through mammillotegmental tract, it conveys information from mammillary body to hypothalamus to the anterior nucleus of thalamus. And through retinohypothalamic fibers, that is optic nerve, it carries visual information from retina to suprachiasmatic nucleus of hypothalamus. And through mammillotegmental tract, it connects mammillary body to the tegmental reticular nuclei of midbrain. And through hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, it connects supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei of hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. And the Tuberoinfundibular tract, it connects arcuate and ventromedial nuclei of hypothalamus to the infundibulum. And through dorsal noradrenergic bundle, it connects locus ceruleus to the dorsal hypothalamus. Through serotonergic neurons, it connects raphe nuclei to the hypothalamus. To, through Mesolimbic dopaminergic system, it connects third ventricle to the median hypothalamic nuclei within the hypothalamic nucleus. And through cortico-hypothalamic fibers, it connects cerebral cortex to the hypothalamus directly. These are the different inputs and outputs. The connections of thalamus mainly reserves ascending somatosensory pathways which goes through the thalamus, and with thalamus it is extensively reciprocally connected. And of course it is connected thoroughly with the neocortex. The limbic system receives olfactory and visual impulses, and it influences the neuroendocrine influence on the anterior pituitary, and of course it is going to act on the spinal cord or brainstem, and it has its visceral functions through these centers. Hypothalamic region outside the blood-brain barrier. Hypothalamic areas present outside the blood-brain barrier are organum vasculosum lamina terminalis, that is OVLT, subfornicial organ, that is SFO, area prostrium. These hypothalamic areas are present in the ventral part of the median eminence. Since portal vessels arise in the median eminence, the regions in the median eminence of hypothalamus are present outside the blood-brain barrier. These regions of the hypothalamus also detect change in the osmolality of the blood and are involved in the regulation of blood volume and water intake. Coming to the functions of hypothalamus, the hypothalamus controls many homeostatic functions, visceral and behavioral functions, and also sleep, wakefulness, circadian rhythm, and reproductive functions. So some of the major hypothalamic functions are like they exert endocrine functions, autonomic functions, circadian rhythm, temperature regulation, regulation of the food intake. They're important for regulation of water intake, involved in reproductive function, influence on emotion, the role in sleep, and immunological functions. We're going to see them one by one. Endocrine functions. Hypothalamus controls endocrine functions via its connections with pituitary gland. It controls both anterior and posterior pituitary functions. Hypothalamus is connected with anterior pituitary through portal hypophyseal vessels, with posterior pituitary via hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Control of anterior pituitary functions. Hypothalamus controls secretion of all anterior pituitary hormones by secreting various releasing and inhibiting hormones. These hormones are synthesized in the hypothalamus and transported to the median eminence, from where they enter the portal plexus of the superior hypophyseal artery. From here, the hormones travel along the portal vessels to reach the anterior pituitary. The main releasing and inhibiting hormones are corticotrophin releasing hormone that regulates the ACTH secretion, growth hormone releasing hormone that controls GH secretion, somatostatin that inhibits growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and prolactin secretion, thyrotropin releasing hormone that stimulates the thyroid stimulating hormone secretion, prolactin releasing hormone, prolactin inhibiting hormone, and gonadotropin releasing hormone that stimulates LH and FSH secretion. Many of these hormones act as a neurotransmitter in cerebral cortex and limbic system, and few of them have peripheral actions. Control of posterior pituitary. Hypothalamus secretes two hormones, that is antidiuretic hormone, that is ADH, and oxytocin. These hormones are synthesized by neurons of supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei of the hypothalamus. They are transported along with their axons, that is through hypophyseal tract to posterior pituitary, where they are stored and released into circulation at the time of need. Hypothalamus involved in autonomic functions. That is, uh, they have a sympathetic and parasympathetic control. Hypothalamus has a profound influence on sympathetic functions. In general, stimulation of lateral and posterior hypothalamic areas results in sympathetic responses. Stimulation of lateral area results in general sympathetic activation in the form of piloerection, rise in the blood pressure, increase in the heart rate, sweating, pupillary dilatation, and increase in the secretion of catecholamines. Recently, it has been suggested that separate hypothalamic system exists exclusively for secretion of adrenaline and noradrenaline. Stimulation of posterior hypothalamus results in activation of emotional behavioral pattern such as aggression, fear, or rage, which may be due to its connection with limbic system. However, these behavioral responses are also seen as a part of autonomic responses in true life. Parasympathetic control. Stimulation of the anterior hypothalamus results in parasympathetic responses. Then the hypothalamus is important for maintenance of circadian rhythm. Circadian rhythm means 24 hours fluctuation in the body functions, that is day-night variation or variation during light-dark cycle. Many body functions show circadian pattern. Some of these important functions include sleep habit, corticosteroid secretion, variation in the body temperature, and melatonin secretion. Most of these circadian functions are regulated by hypothalamus. Hypothalamic nucleus regulating and maintaining the circadian rhythm is suprachiasmatic nucleus. Therefore, the SCN is also known as biological, that is, suprachiasmatic nucleus is also known as biological clock. The accuracy of execution of this biological clock is achieved by light and darkness through retinohypothalamic fibers. These fibers convey retinal information about light and darkness via optic chiasma to the SCN, that is suprachiasmatic nucleus. From hypothalamus, information is conveyed to various neuroendocrine structures for maintaining circadian rhythm of various functions. Nocturnal secretion of melatonin is believed to provide important hormonal signal for the regulation of the other functions. The physiological basis of suprachiasmatic nucleus seem to be the rhythmic discharge exhibited by this nucleus. It has been observed that the neurons of SCN continue to discharge rhythmically in vitro even after its removal from the brain. It has been recently proved that there are specific genes in neurons of SCN that regulate rhythmic discharge pattern. 4 such genes have been identified in mammals. In the neurons of SCN, the genes are activated diurnally that synthesize new proteins. The proteins that are formed enter cytoplasm and modify the cell functions. Change in the cytoplasmic activity alters their discharge pattern. Later, the proteins return back to the nucleus and inhibit the genes that produce them. Thus, genes that control rhythmic discharge of SCN are also regulated by negative feedback mechanisms so that the biological clock acts within the physiological range. Hypothalamus is involved in temperature regulation. Regulation of the body temperature depends on the balance between mechanisms that control heat loss and heat gain. Many peripheral and central mechanisms play a role in temperature regulation. The central mechanism In the central mechanism, hypothalamus plays a key role. Role of anterior hypothalamus. Anterior hypothalamus detects body temperature by sensing the temperature of blood and by receiving inputs from thermoreceptors, especially cold receptors located in skin, deep tissues, spinal cord, and other brain areas. If the temperature is above the set point, the anterior hypothalamus activates mechanisms that promote heat loss, especially by causing cutaneous vasodilatation and sweating. Heat loss in turn decreases the body temperature back towards the normal. The role of posterior hypothalamus. Posterior hypothalamus activates mechanisms that increase heat production and promote heat gain. The Posterior hypothalamus depends mainly on the information provided by the cutaneous receptors. If the environmental temperature is low, the posterior hypothalamus activates heat conservation by cutaneous vasoconstriction and piloerection. It also increases the release of catecholamines from adrenal medulla. Many endogenous pyrogens like cytokines act on preoptic area of the hypothalamus to produce fever. These cytokines, such as interleukins, increase the local release of prostaglandins that produce fever by raising the temperature range of set point. In fact, antipyretics act by decreasing the production of prostaglandins. Hypothalamus is involved in regulation of food intake. The regulation of food intake is an integrated phenomenon because of the complex nature of control of eating behavior. Though food intake may mainly depends on the individual's appetite to eat, eating behavior depends on many other psychological and uh, physiological and non-physiological factors. Some of these important factors include psychological, genetic, environmental, and social factors, and quality of the food, nutritional states of the individual, energy expenditure, and interest for food and appetite of the individual at the time of taking food. The long-term regulation of food intake is aimed at maintaining the balance between the intake and energy expenditure so that body weight is maintained within its normal range. However, to make it a simpler one, we classify the factors regulating food intake into three major categories. It is neural factors, hormonal factors, and metabolic factors. And hypothalamus plays a key role in integrating all these three factors. Neural factors. Role of thalamus, hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is a major regulator of food intake. The two areas in the hypothalamus control food intake, the feeding center and the satiety center. Feeding center is the lateral hypothalamus, located in the bed of nucleus of median forebrain bundle at its junctions with palidohypothalamic fibers. The LH, that is the lateral hypothalamus, is called feeding center as its stimulation greatly increases the food intake. On the contrary, experimental lesion of LH results in fetal anorexia and in otherwise healthy animals. Satiety center is the ventromedial hypothalamus is called satiety center because stimulation of it causes cessation of eating, whereas lesion in it causes severe hyperphagia that results in morbid obesity. The obesity due to the ventromedial hypothalamus lesion is called as hypothalamic obesity. Food intake results from interaction between the feeding and satiety center. Normally, the satiety center decreases the food intake by inhibiting the feeding center. Feeding center is believed to be chronically active. Following feeding, activity of satiety center increases, that in turn inhibits feeding center and finally stops feeding. However, it should be remembered that appetite for food is different from desire for food. Appetite is controlled by neural mechanism described above, whereas the desire for food per se is a complex phenomenon. People often eat out of their desire to eat even when they are not hungry. Uncontrolled desire for eating results in excess calorie intake that leads to obesity. The desire to eat food is controlled by the extrahypothalamic structures such as limbic system. Preliminary reports from our laboratory suggest that uh, the hormones or neurotransmitter secreted uh, from the limbic areas of brain influence hypothalamic feeding areas. It is not only the excess food intake per se, but also the desire for food plays important role in the genesis of obesity. This is supported by the fact that there are people who do not develop obesity in spite of high intake. So scientists propose that the hormone is secreted from the limbic areas of brain that, in addition to its effect on stimulation of feeding center in hypothalamus, influences the body weight gained directly by controlling deposition of fat into the fat cells, that is adiposity. Presently, the hormone, the greed hormone, till in its detailed structure and the functions are established scientifically, the identification of this particular hormone and its effects on the hypothalamic feeding areas will be promising impact on the obesity research. Role of other centers. Extrahypothalamic areas in the brain have been recently described to control food intake. Mainly the Mesolimbic areas like amygdala, caudate nucleus, nucleus accumbens, and septal areas, that is lateral and medial septal nuclei, etc. It has been hypothesized that many of these areas influence food intake partly, though not fully, through hypothalamic centers. The role of vagus nerve. Vagus nerve provides sensory signals regarding the filling of stomach to the hypothalamic regulatory centers. Therefore, stretching of the stomach wall by accumulation of the food is immediate factor that inhibit feeding. Coming to hormonal factors, though there is a long list of hormones that influence food intake, the following important are well-established hormones that are going to be discussed here. Most of these hormones are either secreted from hypothalamus or act on hypothalamus to influence food intake. Some of the hormones that increase food intake are the neuropeptide Y, orexins, ghrelin, melanin concentrating hormone, that is MCH, the alkylated peptide, galanin, and growth hormone releasing hormone. Hormones that decrease the food intake are estrogen, dopamine, alpha MSH, CART, that is cocaine and amphetamine regulated transcript, corticotropin releasing hormone, gut hormones, oxytocin, CCK, peptide YY, and leptin. Leptin is the key hormone for regulation of food intake and body weight. Leptin is a polypeptide containing 167 amino acids released from the white fat cells, that is adipocytes. Increase in adipose tissue mass increases plasma leptin level, and decrease in the fat store decreases the leptin concentration. The receptors for leptin are located in the hypothalamus. The leptin, by acting on hypothalamus, decreases the food intake and increases the energy consumption. The arcuate nucleus of hypothalamus, the sensor to detect plasma leptin concentration. Physiological responses to high leptin levels. When high leptin levels occurs, as in obesity, it decreases food intake and increases the energy expenditure and increases the sympathetic activity. And so physiological response to low leptin levels, the low leptin level as occurs in starvation increases the food intake and decreases the energy expenditure and increases the parasympathetic activity. The leptin mediates its effects on food intake by primarily inhibiting the release of neuropeptide Y from hypothalamus. The leptin response to starvation is mainly mediated by the neuropeptide Y, and the response to obesity is mediated by the melanotropic stimulating hormone. The hypothalamus controls food intake accordingly to the adipose tissue mass, that is the degree of obesity in the body. Hypothalamus senses adiposity via leptin and accordingly controls the food intake and energy expenditure of the body. So this is called as lipostatic hypothesis of food intake, according to which the food intake is inversely proportional to the obesity. So when fat adiposity is less, the food intake is going to increase and vice versa. The other actions of leptin are, it is also going to help in the regulation of the onset of puberty. It stimulates thyroid functions, it controls glucocorticoid secretion, it increases the activity of uncoupling of protein in the brown adipose tissue cells. The last three actions increase peripheral energy expenditure. Neuropeptide Y, a polypeptide containing 36 amino acids, is a strong orexogen. That is, orexogen is a substance that increases the food intake. It is secreted mainly from the hypothalamus. The neuropeptide Y containing neurons are present abundantly in arcuate nucleus. The NPY stimulates the food intake by stimulating the feeding center. The neuropeptide Y also inhibits action on various anorexic agents on hypothalamus. NPY has 5 receptors subtypes Y1, Y2, Y3, Y4 and Y5. NPY, that is neuropeptide Y, exerts its effect physiologically via Y1, Y2 and Y5 receptors. However, Y5 receptors mainly mediate food intake. It has been observed that NPY mRNA increases hypothalamic neurons during feeding and decreases during satiation. Orexin. There are two forms of orexin, orexin A and orexin B. The orexins strongly stimulate food intake. Orexins are formed in the lateral hypothalamus. Ghrelin is a polypeptide secreted from stomach and hypothalamus. Recently, it has been discovered to be a potent orexogen. It stimulates food intake and body weight gain. During fasting, ghrelin concentration increases in the plasma, and during feeding, concentration decreases. Estrogen is secreted from the ovary. It is a potent anorexic agent. It crosses the blood-brain barrier to act on the hypothalamic centers. It inhibits feeding center and also decreases the release of neuropeptide Y. Therefore, hyperphagia and obesity are usual features of overoptimized rats. In human beings also, obesity develops following menopause due to the estrogen withdrawal. The dopamine is also a strong anorexic agent. It inhibits food intake by acting on hypothalamus and limbic system. However, injection of hypothalamus into nucleus caudatus and accumbens increases food intake. Thus, dopamine may be the neurotransmitter for drive for food in mesolimbic areas and inhibitory neurotransmitter in the hypothalamic feeding areas. The gut hormones secreted from the GI tract inhibit food intake. Following ingestion, food passes through the GI tract and results in release of gut hormones. These gut hormones inhibit food intake by inhibiting hypothalamic feeding center. This is called as gut peptide hypothesis of regulation of food intake. These hormones are mainly GRP, that is gastrin-related peptide, glucagons, somatostatin, and CCK. CCK is the most important among them. Cholecystokinin acts peripherally and centrally to inhibit food intake. Peripherally, it acts on the visceral receptors and centrally acts on hypothalamus. There are two types of CCK receptors, CCKA and CCKB. Peripheral receptors are mainly CCKA, whereas central receptors are both CCKB and CCKA. In the hypothalamus, CCKB receptors are present more in numbers. Therefore, CCKB antagonist profoundly inhibits satiety and increases food intake. Coming to metabolic factors, that is, plasma glucose concentration is an important metabolic factor for regulation of feeding. The discharge of ventromedial hypothalamus, that is satiety center, partly depends on its glucose utilization. Following feeding, the plasma glucose concentration rises, that in turn increases the activity of neurons of satiety center. Increased discharge of satiety center inhibits feeding center, that finally inhibits food intake. Thus, the person feels satiated. The food intake remains inhibited till the food glucose concentration, that is blood glucose concentration, remains high. This is called as glucostatic hypothesis of regulation of food intake. Hypothalamus, by sensing plasma glucose concentration, not only regulates food intake but also indirectly regulates plasma glucose concentration. Therefore, hypothalamus is called, it is called glucostat. and hypoglycemia is a potent stimulus for food intake. Malonyl-CoA accumulation in the tissue inhibits food intake. Malonyl-CoA produced from acetyl-CoA. Malonyl-CoA is converted into fatty acids by fatty acid synthase. Therefore, currently the focus of research is to develop an agent which will inhibit fatty acid synthase so that malonyl-CoA can accumulate and inhibit feeding. Malonyl-CoA is also seen to inhibit hypothalamic neuropeptide Y synthesis by inhibiting formation of NPY mRNA. It also induces weight loss and decreases fat store. Amino acids and fatty acids. Among the chemical agents that give rise to satiety are certain amino acids and fatty acids absorbed from GI tract. Body temperature. Increase the food intake and increase in the body temperature the decrease in the body temperature increases the food intake, and increase in the body temperature inhibits the food intake. So this is called as thermostatic hypothesis of food intake. Therefore, anorexia is a common feature of fever due to any cause. In fact, the change in the food intake changes the body temperature and vice versa. Hypothalamus also involved in regulation of water intake. Hypothalamus plays an important role in water intake. The two major factors that affect water intake are plasma osmolality and extracellular fluid volume. The hypothalamus responds to change in both these factors. Thus, hypothalamus is a major thirst center in the brain. The OVLT and SFO are the hypothalamic areas that responds to thirst. The osmoreceptors located in the anterior hypothalamus. Osmoreceptors detect the change in the osmolality of the plasma. Hyperosmolality of the plasma stimulates hypothalamic thirst center that increases water intake. Hyperosmolality also increases ADS secretion that decreases loss of water in urine by increasing water reabsorption from the kidney tubules. The volume change is detected by volume receptors in the right and left atria and pulmonary vessels. Hypovolemia increases the secretion of renin from juxtaglomerular cells of kidney that in turn forms angiotensin II, and which is a strong disposion that it is a substance that stimulates the thirst, and they all stimulates OVLT and SFO to increase water intake. Control of reproductive functions. Hypothalamus secretes gonadotropin releasing hormone that plays a crucial role in reproductive functions and sexual behaviors. The GnRH secreting neurons are located in the preoptic area, and these neurons contain receptors for gonadal hormones that regulate GnRH secretion. The GnRH secretion begins at puberty and then continues throughout the reproductive life. GnRH is essential for attainment of reproductive function in both male and females. Hypothalamus also controls sexual behavior. Stimulation of medial forebrain bundle in experimental animals induces penile erection and sexual drive, whereas lesion of the anterior hypothalamus abolishes this sexual behavior. Hypothalamic testosterone implants restore normal sexual functions in castrated male rats. In female, medial preoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus regulate sexual behavior. Hypothalamic estrogen implants induce estrous heat in ovrectomized rats. However, sexual functions in male and female are further influenced by limbic system. Hypothalamus also influences emotions. Limbic system is the principal seat of emotion. Hypothalamus forms one of the output pathway of limbic system for emotional responses. Suitable stimulation of lateral hypothalamus activates rage reaction in animals. Self-stimulation experiments have established that the reward system in hypothalamus is located in the lateral preoptic area. Role in sleep. There are three subcortical regions that, on appropriate stimulation, induce slow wave sleep. The encephalic sleep zone is one among them. The major part of this zone is in the posterior hypothalamus. Stimulation of preoptic area of hypothalamus also induces sleep. By regulating circadian rhythm, hypothalamus controls sleep. The role of hypothalamus in immunity. Hypothalamus influences immunity by controlling the secretion of cortisol via hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis. Many stressful stimuli suppress immunity by stimulating hypothalamic CRH release that increases the ACTS secretion from anterior pituitary, that in turn promotes cortisol synthesis and cortisol secretion from the adrenal cortex. Some of the applied aspects related to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamic dysfunctions are usually known as hypothalamic syndromes. Hypothalamic syndromes are broadly divided into two categories: the global hypothalamic syndrome and partial hypothalamic syndromes. Global hypothalamic syndrome. In global hypothalamic syndrome, the disease process involves either all parts of or large part of hypothalamus. Primary tumors or metastatic carcinoma, lymphoma, or a granulomatous disease like sarcoidosis affecting the hypothalamus results in such syndromes. Usually, the patient dies due to the failure of visceral homeostatic mechanism and failure to regulate body temperature. Partial hypothalamic syndrome. Partial hypothalamic syndromes occur due to the selective lesion of a specific part of hypothalamus, usually resulting in deficiency or overproduction of a single hormone. Some of these important syndromes are given below. Diabetes insipidus, that is neurogenic diabetes insipidus, occurs in hypothalamic or pituitary tumors affecting secretion of ADH. Neurogenic salt wasting occurs as a part of SIADH, that is syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion. Precocious puberty occurs in hypothalamic tumor, and which is going to result in premature and excess secretion of which occurs because of the excess secretion of GnRH, which is one of the cause for precocious puberty. Body weight alteration. The lesion in the lateral hypothalamus results in failure to eat, and lesion of medial hypothalamus causes overeating. Such lesions occur in various brain tumors like craniopharyngiomas. Anorexia nervosa and bulimia. Several functional alterations in hypothalamic nuclei result in either anorexia nervosa or bulimia. They are more of behavioral disorder than organic hypothalamic disease. Disturbance in the temperature regulation. The bilateral lesions in the anterior parts of the hypothalamus results in severe hyperthermia. So there can be hypothalamic cardiovascular disorder when hypothalamus with its limbic connection can mount to a massive sympathor-adrenal discharge to provoke arrhythmias, hypertension, as it occurs in extreme emotional stress. Then neurogenic pulmonary edema. The lesion of the caudal hypothalamus causes pulmonary edema. There occurs the rapid rise in the pulmonary vascular resistance, which may be fatal unless treated immediately. So this is in brief about hypothalamus, its nuclei, their connection, and some of the important functions of hypothalamus. Thank you.